If you own a home in Texas, the number on your listing might be falling. But the cost of owning that home is not. Mortgage payments are heavier. Property taxes are still locked to peak valuations. Insurance bills keep rising, even as buyers hesitate. This is the paradox shaping 2026. Homes are getting cheaper, but living in them is getting more expensive. For buyers, it feels risky. For sellers, it feels unfair. For investors, it feels like a trap closing in. And across Texas, in cities once marketed as safe bets, this pressure is no longer theoretical. So the question is simple. Which Texas city is quietly draining household budgets the fastest, even as prices slide? By 2026, the U.S. housing market is no longer driven by urgency. It is driven by hesitation. For the first time in years, the balance of power is shifting away from sellers and toward buyers, but not in the way many people expected. Mortgage rates did not fall quickly enough to restart demand. Instead, they stayed high long enough to reset buyer psychology. Monthly payments, not listing prices, became the real gatekeeper. A house that looked affordable on paper suddenly felt dangerous once taxes, insurance, and maintenance were added back into the equation. At the same time, inventory has been quietly building, not all at once and not everywhere, but enough to change behavior. Homes that once sold in days now sit for weeks. Price cuts appear, disappear, then return. Deals go under contract and quietly fall apart when financing no longer works at today's rates. And this cycle is different from previous downturns for one critical reason. Prices are adjusting downward while the engines that once justified those prices are no longer accelerating. Job growth has slowed in key sectors. Remote work has weakened the link between employment and location. Migration flows that once rushed towards Sunbelt markets like Texas are flattening, or in some cases, reversing. Meanwhile, the cost side of ownership has become stubborn. Property taxes remain elevated because assessments lag the market. Insurance premiums, especially in states exposed to storms, heat, and flooding, have moved in one direction only: up. Builders who started projects during the era of cheap money are now delivering homes into a market that no longer absorbs supply effortlessly. This creates a quiet squeeze. Sellers hesitate to cut deeply because they remember peak prices. Buyers hesitate to commit because they fear catching a falling knife. Investors, once confident in endless demand, now discover that even a single vacant month can erase a year's projected return. If this were just one city, it would be a local story. But across Texas, the same pattern keeps appearing, again and again, each time shaped by a different economy, a different promise, and a different kind of risk. If this breakdown is helping you see past the headlines and into the real pressure building beneath the Texas housing market, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the 7 real stories that come next. Because the downturn isn't arriving everywhere at once, it's arriving city by city. 1. Waco? For decades, Waco was not a housing story at all. It was a place people passed through. A modest city between Dallas and Austin where homes traded quietly, mostly among local families. Prices moved slowly, and affordability was part of its identity. That changed when Waco became a brand. Television exposure, weekend tourism, and its midpoint location turned the city into a destination. Outside buyers arrived looking for character homes, renovation projects, and cheap properties with upside. Investors followed, buying bungalows and ranch houses with plans to flip, rent short-term, or hold for appreciation. New subdivisions expanded outward, priced for people who did not work in Waco but liked the idea of living there. For a while, the numbers worked. Low mortgage rates masked risk. Renovations penciled out. Listings moved fast enough to justify aggressive pricing. But by 2026, the assumptions behind that surge are breaking down. Mortgage rates stayed high, and Waco's local wages never caught up with peak-era prices. The short-term rental rush cooled, while regulators began paying closer attention to how many visitor-focused properties a small city could absorb. Remote workers now have more choices across the Sun Belt, and Waco is no longer the automatic bargain it once seemed. The stress shows up quietly. Homes sit longer. Price reductions stack up in listing histories. Renovated houses with fresh interiors struggle when appraisals come in below expectations. Buyers ask for concessions or walk away entirely. Owners who used renovation loans feel squeezed by higher monthly payments and rising property taxes with fewer exits available. Waco still has tourism. It still has location. But when a small market is priced for outsiders instead of the people who live and work there full-time, even a modest pullback in demand can force a sharp reset. And that raises the next question. If a small city like Waco is already bending under speculative pressure, what happens when the same forces collide with coastal risk? 2. Corpus Christi. For most of its history, Corpus Christi was defined by work, not speculation. The port, refineries, shipping, fishing, and tourism supported a housing market that stayed within reach of local incomes. Coastal living existed here, but it was not packaged as a luxury product. Prices reflected that reality. That balance shifted when buyers from outside Texas began looking for coastal property they could still afford. Listings near the Bay and Barrier Islands looked cheap compared to Florida or California. Second home buyers arrived. Investors bought small houses and duplexes, expecting steady demand from refinery workers, tourists, and short-term renters. For a moment, Corpus Christi felt undervalued. By 2026, that story looks very different. Insurance costs along the Gulf Coast have climbed sharply. Wind and storm coverage that once felt manageable now consumes a meaningful share of monthly housing costs. Property taxes followed higher appraisals set during the boom, even as prices softened. Local wages tied to industrial and service work did not rise fast enough to offset those increases. The result is a widening affordability gap. Homes that once felt like bargains no longer do when buyers run the full cost of ownership. And listings sit longer in older inland neighborhoods and in newer subdivisions on the edge of the city. Sellers cut prices, then cut again. Houses that drew multiple offers in 2022 now attract cautious buyers asking for repairs, credits, or walking away altogether. Investors are feeling the shift most clearly. Vacancy, maintenance, and higher insurance quickly erase projected returns. What looked like safe cash flow on paper becomes fragile in practice. One storm season, one empty month, or one unexpected repair is enough to flip the numbers. Corpus Christi is not collapsing. The port is still active. The coastline is still there. But the city appears on this list because coastal risk has turned ownership costs into a pressure point. And when affordability breaks at the monthly level, prices are forced to follow. So the question becomes, if rising costs are already straining a coastal city, what happens when the pressure reaches a market once known for stability? 3. San Antonio. For years, San Antonio built its reputation on one promise: stability. Not as flashy as Austin, not as sprawling as Houston, but large, diverse, and affordable. Military bases, healthcare systems, tourism, and a growing service economy gave the city a broad foundation. Housing prices moved steadily, rarely violently. That reputation became its own marketing tool. As Austin prices surged, buyers were told the same thing again and again. If you can't afford Austin, try San Antonio. Out-of-state newcomers listened. Investors followed. Homes on the north side and fast-growing outer suburbs, and in older neighborhoods near downtown, were suddenly priced for people arriving from more expensive markets, not for the families already living there. By the early 2000s, the math no longer worked for locals. Paychecks stayed mostly the same, while property taxes climbed with rising appraisals. Insurance costs followed. What had once been a comfortable mortgage turned into a stretched payment. By 2026, that pressure has accumulated long enough to change behavior. Buyers are stepping back. They are not rushing. They are comparing options. Builders who once sold out entire phases now offer incentives and closing assistance. Listings show more reductions, more failed contracts, and more sellers testing prices the market is no longer willing to accept. Small landlords feel the squeeze as well. Rents have grown, but not fast enough to offset higher loan payments, taxes, and repairs. A single vacancy or unexpected expense can turn a marginally positive rental into a loss. Some investors are deciding that holding no longer makes sense, and every new listing adds supply to an already cautious market. San Antonio remains a major city with real economic strengths. But when a place known for affordability becomes a place where buying feels like a risk instead of an upgrade, prices are forced to adjust. And that leads to a bigger question. If a safe city like San Antonio is cracking under slow pressure, what happens in markets built on scale and exposure? For Houston, Houston has always played by different rules. No traditional zoning, endless room to expand, an economy tied to energy, shipping, healthcare, and global trade. For decades, that flexibility created a belief that even if Houston slowed down, it would always bounce back. The last boom reinforced that confidence. Master-planned communities spread outward in every direction. Townhomes filled the inner loop. Mid-rise and high-rise projects reshaped parts of downtown. Investors bought at scale, convinced that population growth and job creation would absorb whatever supply came online. By 2026, that assumption is being tested. Mortgage rates remain high. Insurance costs in flood-prone and storm-exposed areas have surged. Property taxes, assessed during peak valuations, remain stubborn even as demand softens. At the same time, homes that were started during the cheap money era are still being delivered into a cooler market. The stress shows up unevenly, but clearly. In certain suburban zip codes, inventory is building faster than buyers are stepping in. Identical floor plans appear again and again on listing sites, each one priced slightly below the last. In older neighborhoods, repaired homes that once sold quickly now sit as buyers weigh flood history, insurance quotes, and long-term costs more carefully. Investors feel the shift first. Cash flow that once looked reliable becomes fragile when premiums rise and vacancies stretch longer than expected. Some owners are testing the market, hoping to exit before conditions worsen. Others hold on, discovering that Houston's size does not prevent localized declines. Houston is too large to collapse all at once. But price declines rarely start with headlines. They start quietly, zip code by zip code, when sellers outnumber confident buyers. And that raises the next question. If a city built on scale and resilience is repricing at the margins, what happens in places where prices ran far ahead of household limits? 5. Frisco. For years, Frisco represented the ideal version of Texas suburbia. Top-ranked schools, brand new infrastructure, professional sports facilities, master-planned communities promising a complete lifestyle within a few miles. For families relocating to North Texas, Frisco was not just a place to live, it was a destination. During the boom, that reputation fueled aggressive pricing. Dual-income households stretched for 5-bedroom homes on tight lots. Builders raised prices phase by phase, sometimes before construction even began. Investors paid premiums for single-family rentals, confident that high-earning families would always line up for access to Frisco's schools and amenities. By the end of that cycle, the numbers became extreme. Entry-level homes carried jumbo-size mortgages. Property tax bills ballooned as appraisals followed prices upward. Monthly housing costs climbed to levels that only worked as long as rates stayed low and incomes kept rising. In 2026, those assumptions are no longer holding. Higher interest rates have cut directly into borrowing power, even for well-paid professionals. Some major employers are hiring more cautiously, while remote work has loosened the need to live in one specific suburb. Buyers are no longer willing to stretch endlessly just to secure a Frisco address. The shift is subtle but telling. For sale signs linger at the ends of cul-de-sacs. Builders who once relied on waiting lists now offer closing assistance, upgrades, and incentives that were unthinkable a few years ago. On the resale market, price histories show a pattern of gradual reductions as sellers slowly let go of peak-era expectations. Frisco is not facing a sudden collapse. Its risk lies in arithmetic. When a city's housing market depends on nearly every buyer stretching to the limit, even a small pullback in demand can force a meaningful reset. And that leads to the next question. If the most polished suburb in North Texas is starting to bend, what happens in the metro core where brand and reality are already drifting apart? 6. Dallas. Dallas has always sold itself in superlatives. Bigger office parks, bigger highways, bigger suburbs. As corporate relocations poured in and cranes filled the skyline, the belief took hold that Dallas real estate was a one-way bet. If the city kept growing, prices would take care of themselves. During the boom, that belief hardened into strategy. Investors renovated aging homes in Oak Cliff and East Dallas, assuming every block would soon be the next hot neighborhood. Families stretched for new builds far from the core, accepting toll roads and long commutes as the cost of entry. Condos in Uptown and Victory Park sold on the promise that proximity to the skyline would always protect value. By 2026, the shine has dulled. Some headline relocations did not translate into the job growth people expected. Remote work weakened the link between a Dallas-based job and a Dallas-based household at the same time. Property tax bills swelled as peak appraisals locked in high assessments, while insurance costs refused to move lower. The change shows up block by block. In central neighborhoods, fully renovated homes sit long enough for staging furniture to gather dust. On the edges of the metro, builder subdivisions compete directly with one another, forcing incentives, upgrades, and quiet discounts. Buyers who once rushed to lock something in now slow down, knowing more options are coming. Sellers feel the tension. Many are anchored to peak-era comparables that no longer reflect buyer behavior. Each price reduction tests how much confidence is left in the Dallas story. Investors who expected easy exits discover that liquidity disappears quickly when too many listings chase too few committed buyers. Dallas will remain a major business hub, but its housing market is learning a hard lesson. Brand alone cannot override household budgets forever. When expectations drift too far from what buyers can actually pay, prices are pulled back to reality. And that leaves one final question. If even Dallas is being forced to reconnect with the math, what happens in the city that pushed belief the furthest of all? 7. Austin. Austin is where the Texas housing story turned into a national myth. Live music and tech campuses, food trucks and venture capital, lakes, glass towers, and a culture that promised creativity and growth without limits. For years, the narrative was simple. Austin was the future, and anything bought there would be worth more later. That belief powered one of the fastest price runs in the country. Modest bungalows in South Austin sold for sums that would have sounded impossible just a few years earlier. East Austin blocks transformed from auto shops and small homes into sleek infill projects. In suburbs like Round Rock, Leander, and Kyle, entire neighborhoods sold out before the streets were fully paved. Investors came from everywhere. Some bought near downtown to rent room by room to tech workers. Others targeted large homes near top schools. Build-to-rent communities spread along the metro's edges. All of it rested on one assumption. As long as Austin kept pulling in people and companies, there was no such thing as overpaying. By 2026, that assumption is cracking. Higher interest rates made peak prices feel heavy almost overnight. Tech hiring slowed, expansion plans cooled, and the city's already high cost of living collided with mortgage payments set at boom-era valuations. Suddenly, winning a bidding war no longer felt like a victory. It felt like a liability. The shift shows up clearly in listings. Clusters of nearly identical suburban homes sit for sale, each owner trying to stay just ahead of the next price cut. Downtown condos aimed at remote workers linger as buyers question job stability and long-term demand. Sellers who need to move discover that their equity is thinner than expected, and sometimes gone entirely. Austin is still vibrant. The festivals still happen. The skyline still grows. But no other Texas city pushed its housing market further on pure belief. And when belief blinks, even briefly, the adjustment is not theoretical. It is happening door by door. Across Texas, The pattern is no longer subtle. Different cities, different economies, different promises. Yet the outcome keeps repeating. Home prices rose on optimism, migration stories, and cheap money. Costs rose on taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Wages did not keep pace. And when interest rates stayed high long enough to expose the math, the illusion broke. This downturn is not driven by panic. It is driven by limits. Limits on what households can carry each month. Limits on how far buyers are willing to stretch. Limits on how long investors can tolerate thin margins before one vacancy or one repair wipes out a year of gains. The common thread is not geography. It is behavior. FOMO, overconfidence. The belief that prices only move in one direction. The assumption that growth stories replace balance sheets. In market after market, young homes were priced not for the people who live there, but for the people expected to arrive next. Now those expectations are being tested. Not everywhere at once, not with headlines, but quietly, through listings that linger, price cuts that repeat, and sellers who discover that liquidity disappears faster than they imagined. This raises the question that matters most for 2026. Is this simply a correction after an extreme run-up? Or the early stage of a longer cycle where housing must realign with incomes, jobs, and real monthly budgets? If you live in one of these cities, the answer affects your equity. If you are trying to buy, it affects your timing. And if you invested believing Texas was immune, it affects your exit. If this breakdown helped you see past the headlines and into the pressure building beneath the Texas housing market, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share your experience in the comments, whether you're holding, selling, or waiting. Because a house is more than a number on a chart, it's a bet on a paycheck, a place, and a future. And in Texas, that bet is being recalculated, one city at a time.